What I intend to do for part 2 is to fill these voids with epoxy, let that set up, then I'll give it a good sanding, and finally we'll go through and put poly on everything, and only after all that's done, then I'll do my final assembly. Okay, welcome back to part 2. Before we get started, I want to talk about a couple of quick changes that I had to make. The legs that we had were just too narrow. They didn't come out quite as far as we would have liked. And so I added an extra piece of wood here. This is about another little over 4 inches to the width, and this brings these out, the legs out to the width from here to here. This is side to side that we were looking for. And since I'm working with a limited amount of lumber, I had to use that center stretcher to add to these legs. And so since that's gone, I've got to come up with a different idea on how to support those legs. So I'll be tucking some angle irons up underneath the table to attach the legs to the tabletop. And it won't take much, but what I found was some real hefty angle iron. This was actually a piece that I salvaged out of the house when we took the fireplace down. This was along the top edge of the fireplace, and I knew someday I would need it. So we'll begin by cutting this to length. I'm doing just a couple of 10-inch segments here. So we'll get these cut to length. So we'll begin by just cleaning up the edges here with a grinder, and then once that's done, we'll grind off the surface and get that cleaned up. Now I'll drill some holes to attach to the leg and to the tabletop. I'll countersink these holes. So that when I put these screws in, they'll drop in nice and flush. And then finally, we'll shoot a coat of paint on them just so they look nice and clean, although these really won't be visible unless you lay on the floor to look at them. All right, so there they are. Got the final coat of paint on those. I'll set those aside to dry, and they'll be ready when we want to assemble the legs. I'm using a 2-part epoxy to fill those voids. In addition to that, I'll use some epoxy pigment to give it a little different color because I don't want it clear. So I tested a little bit of it and put a few drops in, and I'm getting a kind of a caramel color. I think this is going to be fine. So we'll give that a try. Okay, it's showtime. Here's my epoxy. I got the color I want. Now what I'm going to do on these is probably fill them. I don't know if there's enough here to fill them completely. We'll see how it goes, but I'll start by doing a little bit in each one and kind of work my way up. And that way, if I do have to mix another batch, what I'll be able to do is mix a batch to finish both of them so that I won't have any color variation if that happens. So here we go. Here goes nothing. I've got lots of time to work with this. It takes about 72 hours for it to cure. Pretty runny stuff, so it will find a level. I'm going to overfill these just slightly since I believe it might settle just a bit. And it really doesn't matter if it's a little over the top because this will all be sanded. There's a couple other spots that I wanted to hit, and here's what I'm thinking. Is I've got some areas that are kind of rough, kind of porous, and it's right around these knots. What I want to do is just put a thin layer of epoxy over this and just kind of let it self-level. And then it should fill all these little tiny voids in, and I should be able to then sand that off. We'll see. We'll see what it does. We'll just drop a thin layer on here and let it kind of spread on its own. And if it doesn't seem to spread out enough, I'll get a little stick and push it around a little bit too. I don't want to put too much on here because I don't want to end up having to do too much sanding. I would like to get enough on here to fill these voids so that I get a good smooth finish when I'm ready to put my poly on. Got another spot right here too. And it covers this whole area. All right, next I'm going to hit this with a torch to take some of the bubbles out, and it doesn't take much. You can see how that just takes the bubbles out instantly. All right, we'll check back in 72 hours. Okay, it's about 5 hours later, and you can see the level on that void is way down, and that's because I had a leak. I did take the time to put a tarp underneath this because I didn't want it to get on my workbench, but it looks like, and it actually leaked. I could see it was leaking shortly after I got it on there. So I pulled it off and I put a little bit more tape underneath there and put it back down. It looks like it's now set up. It won't leak any further, but I've got to fill that space that's there. So let's add just a little bit more. We'll let that settle out, and then I'll hit that with a torch to take out the bubbles. All right, we'll check back in a couple days. So it's 3 days later. Everything is dried and hardened, cured. It's not sticky at all. Pretty much everything stayed where it was supposed to stay. So now I will begin sanding. I'm going to start with a random orbital and some 80 grit. I might even have some 60 laying around. And it's my hope that I can do it with a random orbital. If that's not aggressive enough, I can switch to a belt sander, but I'd like to leave that as my last resort. I found some 60 grit. I think I'll start with that, and I flipped this thing over. I'm going to work on the back side first, and then I'll work my way around. Alright, that's enough with the belt sander. I got the bulk of it off of there. You can see now this is all the epoxy that filled in those huge knots here and here. And I got the rest off. And I'm sure anybody that was watching as I was putting that epoxy down, anybody who's worked with epoxy was probably just screaming at the computer for me to back off and not put so much down. That's a lot of sanding to take that stuff off. When you're gluing up boards, sanding covers up a multitude of woodworking sins. Here's an example, and this is the worst of it. I'm working on the legs right now. This board has a bit of a bow to it. Wasn't bad enough, and it's such a short distance to really worry about it too much. But when I glued these up, it left a pretty good lip here. It's probably between a 32nd and a 16th. So I'm going to fix that with a sander. I wouldn't want to do this on a big long length, but I will do it here. And I'll come back and show you the end result when I'm done. Alright, about 10 minutes of sanding. Here's my edge right there. It's all cleaned up. Okay, so I made it all the way through my first pass with the belt sander, then onto the orbital with the 60 grit, and finally finished up the day here on the 80 grit. I'm done for the day. This sander is done. It burned out, and fortunately I've got two of these, but probably too much heat for this thing. I should have gave it a rest sooner. So I'll pick it up tomorrow and move on to my 120 grit, and then finally a 240, And then maybe I'll take some 400 wet dry paper and just go over these pieces of epoxy here to give them a nice finish, and then I'll be ready for poly. Let's get started with the first coat of poly. This table is going to get as many coats of poly as it needs. What I mean by that is I'm going to put a coat on and I'm going to sand it, and then I'll put another coat on and I'll sand it, and then I'll just keep going until it looks the way I want it to look. Now this is a satin poly, and so we're not going to have a real high gloss, but it's going to have a little bit of sheen to it. If I was making a picture frame, I might only do one coat of wiping poly, which is kind of a thin poly, a lot easier to put on. But this being a coffee table, this is going to take a beating. And as such, no doubt you'll get at least 3 coats, probably more. Let's get a look at this with the first coat on. You can see that epoxy now. It's got kind of a caramel color. This poly just makes every feature in the grain just pop out. Kind of like some of these irregularities in this grain. I think it's going to look real nice when it's done. So now the hardest part of doing this work is to now just wait for this poly to dry and be disciplined enough not to jump in and try to sand it before it's completely dry. So once it's dry, I'll sand this and we'll repeat, and I'll sand and repeat until it's done and I'm happy with it. I'm done applying poly. I put 4 coats of regular polyurethane down, and then for my last coat I used this wipe-on poly, and it's a lot thinner and tends to build up a little bit less. So we'll see how this turns out. There it is, all finished. Those angle irons, I was wondering about whether that would make it sturdy enough. These legs are nice and sturdy. The only thing I may do yet is try to buff out the top just a little bit more. There's a few streaks in there I'm not real happy with, so we'll see how it goes. Thanks for sticking around.